There is a certain silence that lives above old Europe, a silence carried by mountains that have watched empires rise and fall. When night settles on that land, it feels heavier, as if history itself is taking a breath. And somewhere in that breath, a single figure waits. A figure made of memory and fear, of real blood and imagined shadows. Before the stories, before the novels, before the cinema glow, there was a man, and around him grew a legend that would not die. Most names fade. This one deepened. This one became a doorway into the oldest night the region remembers. I am tracing that night now, moving backward through centuries, following the trail that leads from quiet villages to battlefields, from sickness to superstition, from one prince in Wallachia to a symbol recognized around the world. The journey is long, but it is steady, and each step pulls us deeper into the soil where old fears still breathe. This is the complete history. The man, the myth, the transformation, the afterlife that spread through culture like a dark root system, and the reason this story, above all others, survives. The name comes now, carried on the weight of 600 years of telling and retelling. Dracula, not as a monster, not as a jump scare, but as a phenomenon shaped by war, by folklore, by literature, and by the human mind itself. Settle in. The night is opening, and the path begins here. There is a darkness that has weight, a kind of pressure that accumulates when generations fold themselves into the same fields. The Balkans kept that pressure like a fossil keeps the shape of an animal. It was not simply night as absence. It was night as presence, a thick curtain thrown over villages, a patient thing that listened for missteps. People who lived with that night did not lean on abstract explanations. They built practical responses, rituals that read like engineering for the soul. The everyday world and the other world were contiguous, like rooms that shared an open doorway and refused to agree on which one was the front. Language itself carries the memory. Strigoi, moroi, frikolakas, words with blunt sounds, each one a shorthand for a cluster of fears and observations. They described different kinds of restlessness. Some of these revenants were thought to be the dead who rose because of bad luck or wrong behavior. Others were alive but changed, afflicted, or possessed. Demons of bloodlessness, hunger that continued after burial, figures that returned in dreams and in footprints. Each term came with its own set of signs and remedies, a local taxonomy of peril. Folklore functioned as both law and medicine. When someone fell ill without obvious cause, when milk turned sour, when a child kept waking with a pallor that no midwife could fix, these terms were offered as explanations, and with explanation came an action. The actions were as practical as they were symbolic. Stakes hammered into ground, repeated, measured, hammered, until the sound itself felt like a sentence. Stones placed under chins of the dead, coins placed in mouths to seal passage, nails driven through tongues to stop speech from being used across the boundary. Sometimes the head was separated from the body and buried elsewhere. Sometimes the corpse was burned and the ashes scattered to wind. Garlic strung in windows, hawthorn branches laid across thresholds, iron hammered into doorframes. Candles burned until wax pooled like fossilized light. These were not random superstitions. They were the product of long experience in an environment where the cause of misfortune seldom yielded to easy investigation. Rituals were experiments repeated until they fit the observed world. Weather and disease shaped belief as much as any sermon. Long winters, crop failure, a pestilence that desiccated stock, the slow wasting of a household, created patterns that demanded meaning. Illness that spread along family lines looked and felt like a contagion of spirit as well as body. The mind is adept at pattern finding, and in a pre-modern context, pattern often became person. If the elder of a house wasted away and others followed, the explanation that a restless dead had returned carried a clarity that miasma or malnutrition could not. It offered a remedy one could act upon. It offered a narrative where agency returned to the living. In communities that must make stories serve life, the supernatural and the medical co-authored each other. Communities also guarded the boundary through law-like practice. Funeral rites tightened, prayers lengthened. The placement of graves observed rituals with the vigilance of infrastructure. A grave was sometimes marked not only to honor but to control, a site managed with the intent to ensure the dead remained dead. In places where wolves and strangers moved, funerary care took on heightened importance. A body not properly prepared could be a locus for anxiety. The spoken word could animate fear, so silence itself became a technique. Families carried names that avoided calling back the wrong thing, euphemisms used to prevent attention. In that cultural economy, speech was currency and a possible lure. The landscape contributed to the psychology. Forests closed in like walls, rivers turned and concealed. Mountain passes funneled travel into narrow corridors, where rumor could travel faster than trade. Villages sat in shadows, not only of geography, but of memory. Places where a single violent act might be retold until the retelling had the power to alter behavior. A crossroads with a tall oak might become a site of legend, because so many minor tragedies accumulated there that people noticed a pattern. The human mind then tells a story that makes all events cohere, and the story eventually shapes the way the place is treated, who avoids it, who leaves offerings when they pass. In the mind shaped by such a world, the dead were not inert facts. They were active presences whose behavior could be tracked and negotiated. Dreams were freighted. Recurring dreams, waking visions, the sensation of an unseen pressure on a chest at midnight. These experiences were data. Certain nights carried old signatures they folded and repeated, like a familiar rhythm. When the living perceived a continuity across such events, mythic figures grew teeth. A nameless fear accumulated and then acquired a face. That face could be a warning. It could be a way of distributing guilt. It could be a tool of social control. Or it could be the only plausible explanation for a house in which luck had become a stranger. This was not a world starved of imagination. It was a world in which imagination was a calibration tool, a way to convert complex stochastic events into narratives that could be rehearsed and shared. In stories, the invisible became negotiable. A child taught that a revenant rose because of a particular betrayal also learned about the social codes that govern conduct. Fear became pedagogy. Tales that now seem baroque or cruel were mechanisms for maintaining order and for focusing communal attention on practices that increased survival. Such tales also allowed for collective mourning to be staged. The dead were engaged with in grief that could be theatrical but also therapeutic, a community practicing loss in a manner that kept it intelligible. The continuity of these beliefs across centuries is important. Ancestors passed warnings like heirlooms. A grandmother teaching a granddaughter to knot a thread or to bury a knife under a threshold was teaching tactics born of ancestral memory. Small rituals accumulated like layers of varnish, each generation adding a stroke. Over time, cultural motifs hardened. The idea that certain gestures or implements offer protection became a shared grammar, and from that grammar, larger figures could be composed. The village mind, when seen as a composite creature, prepared a stage for characters who could move easily between history and myth. When violence arrived in the landscape, the mythic and the real braided together. A violent event could be personalized as the work of a particular restless dead, or conversely, a reluctant memory of a violent man could be clothed in revenant imagery to explain his lingering influence. In regions where raiding, conquest, and reprisal were regular cycles, the body politic itself experienced a kind of haunting. A campaign of brutality left both physical and mimetic scars. Leaders who engaged in what modern historians call terror sometimes left behind a social aftertaste that was easily reframed into myth. People's preference for narrative meant that collective trauma would be told and retold until it took on metaphoric dimensions. The earliest vampire stories were not elegant romances. They were blunt articulations of a raw human calculus. A corpse that appeared to have been dug up, a body with blood on the lips, cattle found bled dry, children struck with untraceable pallor, houses stricken with an inexplicable malaise. These events had to be accounted for. The themes that later became literary tropes were born of observation and need. From those quotidian anxieties arose motifs of contamination and boundary violation, motifs that are the deepest wellsprings of the vampire idea. Fear of the outside, fear of infection, fear that loved ones could become sources of harm. These were the fear materials that myth used. The architecture of belief thus set the stage for any figure who would later be called Dracula. The soil had been prepared by centuries of ritual, by practical responses to calamity, and by a collective habit of making stories that functioned like tools. When people later encountered a historical figure of extraordinary violence, when that figure became the subject of rumor and foreign pamphlet, it was only natural that the existing mythic vocabulary would be used to interpret his life. The land and the stories were ready to receive him. He did not invent the fear, he walked into it. Returning mentally to this earlier darkness clarifies why certain motifs feel so inevitable in the story to come. Protection rituals appear as visible traces of a world that had to be managed constantly. The revenant imagined in the hearthlight is the same revenant traced in the margins of tax registers and in the whispered complaints of travelers. The pre-modern night is not a backdrop. It is an active, shaping force folding into the human imagination until the boundary between history and myth is porous. Understanding that ground is essential because Dracula, in name and in the things he came to represent, was grafted onto a world already predisposed to believe in the restless power of the dead. Stone and water and the passage of armies through a narrow valley teach a body what it must become. Wallachia was such a geography, a strip of land folded between mountains and the Danube, a buffer for empires, a place where borders felt like weather. The princes of that region learned early that power in such a place is always precarious, and that survival was often a work of cruel arithmetic. Vlad was born into that calculus, a child of lineage and pledge, baptized into a name that already carried both honor and hazard. His father carried a title that shimmered in two lights. Vlad III, a member of the Order of the Dragon, wore a dragon on his breast for the sake of Christendom and for the sake of alliances. In language and rumor, the dragon became a different thing to different people. To some, it was a shield. To others, it was a brand. The child who inherited that name would later be known by a variant of it, a name that stitched together bloodline and rumor, a name that would be used by enemies and by curious scribes in ways that bent meaning toward menace. The 15th century in that region was not a static tableau. It was a spinning mosaic of raids, treaties, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. The Ottoman Empire pressed at the frontier with a momentum that altered every calculation. In response, local princes entered into uneasy bargains, sending sons as hostages, paying tribute, negotiating marriages, all gestures intended to buy a season of peace. The practice turned families into diplomatic tokens. Vlad and his brother spent years as political pawns, moved between courts as symbols of a fragile peace. Those years in captivity left marks not only on their bodies, but on the ways they imagined power, on how they would later measure justice and revenge. Power in Wallachia required performance. The boyars, the noble families, held localized authority and expected certain rights. A prince who could not command their loyalty risked not only rebellion, but also a thing more dangerous, a slow dissolution of authority that invited worse violence. Politics in that world had a theatrical dimension. Public punishments, proclamations, the display of captured enemies, all of these were a form of statecraft. Theater was also a kind of weapon. Vlad learned early that spectacle could be governance, that terror could be a method for producing order in a landscape where institutional institutions were thin and fragile. The story of his rule reads like a series of gambits. There were alliances with foreign courts, sudden returns to power after exile, and a readiness to use violence as message. Impalement, the method his enemies most often insisted on ascribing, was not merely cruelty for its own sake. It served as a language. A field of impaled bodies on a road is a sentence written in human flesh, addressed to anyone who might consider treachery. It said in the harshest terms, possible that certain behaviors would not be tolerated. Viewed from the perspective of state formation and survival, such measures were a brutal form of deterrence, an attempt to make the cost of betrayal so visible and so permanent that it changed incentives. That explanation does not excuse, it only tries to place violence inside a logic that time and place made plausible. Violence became part of administration. The prince who could make punishment visible in the countryside could alter the calculations of bandit, of noble, of neighbor. Vlad organized patrols, tightened customs, tried to secure roads. He sought to extract order from chaos with a hand that refused compromise. At moments, his methods succeeded in producing stability. At others, they bred more violence by hardening grudges into vendettas. There were also moments of fierce patriotism refracted through a narrow lens. When the Ottoman tide approached, some of his decisions must be read as attempts at national defense, strategies to slow or repel incursions that would have left villages in ruin. Guerrilla attacks by retaking roads, night raids on supply lines, the execution of collaborators. These were tactics aimed at survival. The line between patriot and criminal is often drawn by who writes the chronicle. For Ottoman scribes, he was a rebel and a cruel adversary. For some local accounts, he took measures that prevented worse plunder. The ambiguity of legacy is a function of the few surviving voices and the many lost ones. The boyars mattered because they were the nodes of local power. They could shelter a fleeing prince, or they could cut a deal with an enemy. Internal politics, therefore, demanded a kind of ruthless calculation. To hold a fractious nobility in check, Vlad resorted to measures that were both punitive and exemplary. He confiscated property from those he judged traitors. He centralized customs and attempted to reduce the power of feuds that could splinter the realm. In doing so, he made enemies among the very people whose support he needed. The tension between central authority and local autonomy is a recurring theme in histories of nascent states, and in Vlad, it became a personal drama enacted in the bloodied theater of his rule. Rumor loved him. News traveled as rumor in those roads and taverns, changing with every telling. Western Europe, alarmed by Ottoman expansion and by the general instability on its eastern flank, was hungry for stories that could be read as both entertainment and warning. Travelers, reports, and pamphlets circulated, sometimes based on hearsay, sometimes on embittered testimonies of refugees. In German towns and at courts, exhibitions of exotic cruelty were consumed like curiosities. Accounts that emphasized the grotesque details of impalement and punishment served two purposes at once. They satisfied a morbid curiosity, and they reinforced the image of the eastern frontier as a zone of barbarism needing defense. These pamphlets played with truth in the way that rumor always does. They sometimes exaggerated, often selecting the most lurid images to make a point. A man who had been horrific in certain acts could be shaped into a universal monster by the retelling. When a pamphlet crossed borders and languages, the contours of the man changed, facts condensed into parable. Where local contexts were complex, foreign readers received a simpler story. Here is barbarity. Here is violence. Here is the kind of enemy to fear. In that simplification, the seeds of myth began to take root. Vlad himself tried to control his own narrative through policy and through brutal spectacle. He printed proclamations, he staged public punishments. He sought to present an image of justice that was uncompromising. Yet the same actions that made him appear effective to some made him monstrous to others. A field of impaled corpses might deter a raider and horrify a diplomat. The duality of his reputation shows how a single set of acts can be read in opposite moral grammars. The mental environment of such a prince is worth imagining. Years as hostage paint a certain psychology, a sense that trust must be bought or seized, a suspicion of negotiated loyalties. Facing an empire that moved in vast strategic waves teaches a kind of impatience with subtlety. When the world around a leader is in constant motion, and when survival is measured in months rather than in generations, governance becomes emergency management. That state of continuous emergency favors decisive, often violent action. The slow building of myth also interacted with local folklore in ways that were not accidental. Villagers who already carried images of the revenant and of restless dead could map those ideas onto a real prince whose life was already dramatic. When a man enacted extreme punishments, when rumors of blood and cruelty moved through the country, a narrative bridge formed. The populace could translate the political terror he inflicted into a language they knew, the language of the night and of restless dead. A rumor of a prince who walked at night, who fed on his enemies, who left bodies as warnings, fit easily into pre-existing patterns of fear. The printing press and the movement of pamphlets accelerated the process. A story once local could now have European wings. The press favored certain images, those that would sell or that would serve propaganda. A prince who resisted the Ottomans might be turned into a hero in certain circles and into a monstrous figure in others. The same man could be both anti-Ottoman stalwart and a tyrant in different narratives. That multiplicity explains how a complex historical actor could be transmuted into a symbol so pliable that it could later be cast as a supernatural predator. It is important to resist the temptation to collapse the man into the myth. Vlad was flesh and bone, subject to fear, ambition, and the contradictory demands of his position. He had strategies, allies, enemies, moments of clear policy, and moments of apparent cruelty without clear political gain. He ruled in an era when law was not an abstract principle embodied in institutions, but a set of practices that required constant enforcement. The severity of his responses must be held alongside the contingency of his world. At the same time, the particularity of his brutality contributed to the durability of his name. Some rulers are forgotten because their methods are ordinary. Others become notorious because their methods are exceptional, because their deeds are dramatic enough to be retold. Impalement is an extreme form of theater, and theater scales in rumor. The shape of what he did fit neatly into the cultural imagination of both his contemporaries and of later storytellers. A dramatic act is easier to remember than a dull one, and culture feeds on memorable shapes. When the chronicles of different regions recorded him, they recorded different men. An Ottoman scribe wrote of resistance and rebellion. A Wallachian record might insist on lineage and duty. A German pamphleteer shaped horror into a moral lesson. The mosaic of these accounts created a composite figure who could be read as prince, as tyrant, as defender, as monster. History gave him contours. Rumor stretched and thinned them, and literature would later add new layers of interpretation. Understanding Vlad requires holding these tensions at once. He belonged to a world where violence had political logic, where rumor could travel further than troops, where spectacle was government, and where folklore gave ready metaphors to interpret human cruelty. His life is a study in how historical circumstance and cultural imagination entangle. He was a man making hard choices in a landscape that taught harshness, and he was also the beginning of a narrative that would outlive him by centuries. The prince who walked through fields and forests of his realm left traces that outlived his body. Villagers told tales. Merchants carried rumors across borders. Pamphleteers printed scenes that would be read in distant towns. In that transmission, the specificity of his life became tinctured with the universal themes that folklore and myth always favor. Fear of the other, fascination with cruelty, the temptation to personalize the causes of social calamity. The name that would be used centuries later to label a vampire came from this entanglement of power, rumor, and the human appetite for story. There is a moment in which a name loosens from its origin and begins to travel on its own. A man can become a story, and the story can then outgrow the skin that once contained it. This is what happens when rumor and print and long memory collide. The life of Vlad the Prince was dense with context, yet the tales told about him required fewer details. A simplified narrative travels faster. It is easier to carry across mountains and markets, and by the time it arrives at some distant hearth, it has been reshaped into something both stranger and clearer. Stories move like flotsam on a river. They strike eddies. They catch on bridges. They are picked up by travelers who add pieces and lose others. In the trade routes that threaded Europe, pamphlets and eyewitness reports created a new circulation for horror. A pamphlet printed in a German town could be read in an English parlor weeks later. A story that began as a political lampoon could become a frenzied account of hellish cruelty. The press demanded pictures and words, and the human appetite for wonder answered. When the sensational sells, the sensational expands. The name that would one day be read as Dracula began to find such momentum. The word itself carried a multiplicity of meanings. It could be read as Son of the Dragon, a title tied to an order that defended Christendom. It could be read as the devil. In language and rumor, these meanings could be layered on top of each other until the listener felt dizzy. Foreign tongues molded the sound in ways that exaggerated its menace. A name that, in local speech, might mean lineage, acquired in foreign mouths the resonance of monstrous ancestry. When tales of impalement and public spectacle traveled, they met local imaginations that already fed on revenant stories. Villagers could easily fold the idea of a violent prince into their existing grammar. A man who impaled enemies could be described not only as cruel, but as consuming, as someone who turned life into a display of death. The metaphorical logic is simple. A ruler who leaves the road lined with bodies becomes a living image of the fear he created. If a mythic template for the restless dead exists already in villages, then an especially violent human actor can be read through that template and become, in local speech, a creature of the night. Translation also transfigured the story. A story told in one language loses some domesticated detail when rendered in another. Names are misheard, motives simplified, contexts erased. What had been a tale about political calculation becomes, in translation, an account of appetite. The loss of nuance is not mere accident. It is part of the alchemy by which history becomes myth. The listener, stripped of local knowledge, supplies their own fears. A foreign prince becomes a mirror for anxieties closer to the listener's life, a figure who embodies the worst imaginations a society can conceive. At the same time, oral tradition continued to do its invisible work. You own villages and market squares. Stories were not static. They were argued with, punctuated with detail, altered to teach. A tale of a prince who killed traitors could be turned into a moral about betrayal or into a cautionary legend about the dangers of unchecked power. Over decades, these narratives layered on top of each other like glazes. The historical core became opaque, and what remained visible was a powerful symbol. The process of symbol making also involved the selective memory of chroniclers. Scribes and clerks were not operating from a morality free of bias. They wrote to justify politics, to entertain patrons, to provide moral instruction. A chronicler who wished to warn against cruelty might emphasize certain deeds and omit others. A foreigner eager to stress the barbarity of the East might choose the most lurid detail. These selections mattered because they shaped the archive. Centuries later, readers consulted that archive without always perceiving the editorial choices that formed it. Symbols gather because they are useful. A symbol like Dracula served multiple interests at once. For those who fear the Ottomans, the figure of an Eastern tyrant could be a call to vigilance. For those anxious about domestic tyranny, the tale could be a mirror for the dangers of absolute power. For the gossiping public, the account offered an object of fascination. For authors centuries later, the symbol provided raw material that could be honed into art. The name became a vessel large enough to hold many meanings, from political allegory to existential dread. The detachment of the name from its man is important. When Dracula ceased to be only a genealogical or political title and began to function as a concept, it adopted a new life. A concept can be stretched and lit differently without losing coherence. It can travel into literature, into theater, onto the stage, and into the mind of an author searching for a figure who might capture modern anxieties. That detachment allowed writers to fold into the name fears about contagion, about the foreign body inside the city, about sexual transgression, about immortality as corruption. The symbol proved elastic. This is also a story about how cultures borrow and refashion each other's fears. Eastern images of the restless dead met Western tastes for spectacle, and the result was neither wholly Eastern nor wholly Western. It was a hybrid. The vampire that emerges from this mixing draws from a folk taxonomy born in village life and from the sensational language of early modern print culture. It becomes a myth that can speak to both landscape and metropolis, to peasant and to courtier. The final step in this birth of symbol is not a single event. It is a long process of accretion. Centuries of rumor, the circulation of prints and pamphlets, localized storytelling, the editorial choices of chroniclers, the needs of politics, and the appetites of readers all conspire. In time, the figure that once referred to a complicated political actor becomes a shorthand, a condensed fear that fits easily into a story. When Bram Stoker later sought a name that would carry a burdensome past into a modern novel, he chose one that already resonated. He did not invent all the meaning. He retrieved a name that had been charged by history and rumor, a name that entered with a resonance that allowed him to project new anxieties onto an old emblem. The birth of a symbol is therefore not theft. It is a natural historical movement, a kind of cultural composting, where old materials decay and feed new growth. The man who once ruled a precarious principality becomes at last a sign, and the sign moves through centuries, like a seed on the wind. Understanding that movement is crucial to seeing how Dracula is less a creature sprung from a single imagination and more an artifact of centuries of human fear and storytelling. The 19th century learned how to love decay. The thing was not accidental. Cities swelled, chimneys multiplied, rivers grew sweet with industry and sour with ruin, and the human imagination turned that input into a language. Romanticism had already taught a generation to find beauty in ruin, to move toward melancholy as if it were a kind of aesthetic. That language mutated in the 19th century into something thicker, darker, an appetite for the uncanny that felt both personal and structural. The literary night grew out of these conditions, fed by disease, by yearning, by a metropolitan anxiety that modernity might have a cost whose shape no ledger could show. The brilliant irony is that modernity and its anxieties produced a nostalgia for older darkness. Steam engines pushed the horizon outward while print presses pushed images inward. Travel made the world smaller. Archaeology dug up old civilizations and returned them as curios. At the same time, new social forms rendered some people rootless, a class of minds who felt estranged by the new velocity of life. In that estrangement, the Gothic found a fresh appetite. The past returned not as simple history, but as an atmosphere, a texture that could be inserted into parlors, into serialized fiction, into the drawing rooms where readers learned that the night wore new clothes. Illness performed a strange cultural service in this era. Consumption, tuberculosis, the slow wasting disease that took poets and lovers, was written about like a sacrament. Pale cheeks and quiet coughing became symbols of refined suffering. Romantic poetry had made sickness lyrical. That lyricism ebbed into fiction, giving disease symbolic power. The vampire, which in folk origins had been a blunt figure of hunger and disruption, acquired associations with consumption that were both literal and metaphorical. To lose blood was to lose self. To be drained was to be refashioned as absence. The Victorian imagination loved that ambivalence, the idea that beauty and ruin might be intimate. Mesmerism and the study of hypnotic states made the mind newly suspect and newly interesting. Franz Mesmer offered a vocabulary for unseen currents, for forces that moved through bodies and altered comportment. The discourse around animal magnetism allowed writers to imagine influence without visible instrument, a force that could shape action from the inside. Spiritualism, which rose to prominence in the middle of the century, added the demand that the dead might speak back. Seances multiplied. Mediums sat in curtained rooms. The living asked for contact, and were often answered with ambiguous signs. The border between science and superstition became porous. Scientists who wanted to measure phenomena found themselves beside theologians and charlatans. That porousness created fertile ground for literary experiments that sought to make the unseen feel tactile. Empire and exoticism also shaped the literary night. Travel literature and colonial reports carried images and rumors from Eastern Europe, from the Ottoman lands, from places whose landscapes seemed to Western readers both ancient and menacing. The figure of the foreigner walking into the European city carried the anxieties of expansion in reverse. If empire exported its power, it also imported fears about contamination. The vampire in the metropolis could be read as an inverted imperial figure, a foreign presence lodged in the heart of a modern city, drawing sustenance from urban bodies. This inversion fit neatly into existing anxieties about migration, disease, trade, and sex. Gothic fiction had been evolving through the 18th century, with names like Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis teaching readers to expect ruined abbeys, hidden passages, and the climatic reveal. The early 19th century added new flavors. John Polidori wrote The Vampire in 1819, a compact fiction that introduced a dressed and urbane predator, a figure distant from the rural revenant, yet related by appetite. Polidori's story suggested that the vampire could live among the cultured, that aristocratic worldliness and predation were not mutually exclusive. That juxtaposition planted a seed. Sheridan Le Fanu in the mid-century delivered Carmilla, a tale that added sexual insinuation and female predation to the mix. Le Fanus' novella offered the intimacy of the vampire with its victim as a hurled challenge to social norms about desire and the female body. Periodicals and serialized fiction fed public appetite for these narratives. The Victorian reader encountered stories in installments, waiting between issues for the next scene. That pacing taught a kind of attention that favored suspense, slow reveal, a tightening of dread. The novel in fragments trained minds to live inside a coming dread. Readers practiced patience and reward. The theatricality of serialized publishing meant that scenes could be staged for maximal atmospheric effect. Pauses inserted where tension might simmer until the next delivery. The vampire, with its promise of returning threat, suited that rhythm. Science itself offered metaphors that the imagination used without apology. Theories of contagion, of miasma, of carriers invisible to sight created an idiom for fear. The public debated what caused cholera, what lay behind epidemics that could sweep a quarter of a city in days. When disease could not be pinned with certainty, metaphor rushed in. The vampire met that metaphor like an answer in human form, a predator who moved invisibly, who lodged within the social body and spread harm by intimacy. The fear that someone at table might be the vector of ruin suddenly found a monstrous grammar. Sexual repression provided another axis. The Victorian era insisted on propriety, while the underside of its culture seethed with suppressed passions. Stories that treated transgression as infection or possession therefore fit the moral imagination. The vampire might arrive wrapped in erotic language, the bite read as both violation and forbidden union. Tales that hinted at desire disguised as disease allowed readers to explore taboo ideas while maintaining the safety of moral distance. The vampire thus became a symbol of dangerous longing, of appetite that violated the social order. At the same time, the study of the exotic and of antiquity gave the vampire a rich background. Excavations and translations of ancient texts suggested that the past harbored strange rituals and archaic fears. Folklore collectors began to assemble local tales, noting the contours of original revenant myths. The literate class read those collections with the same hungry curiosity they reserved for travelogues. Writers could then stitch together details gleaned from ethnography, court reports, and village tales into a composite creature who felt both studied and uncanny. Art and theater reinforced the pattern. Stagecraft could produce the uncanny through light and shadow, through trapdoors and painted sets. Henry Irving and his company brought theatricality to the fore in England, dramatizing scenes that moved audiences to simultaneous awe and dread. The stage turned the vampire from an imagined presence into a visible spectacle. Theater also taught authors how to pace reveal, how to craft presence and absence, how to let sound and silence work as collaborators in producing fear. Finally, the era produced writers who were willing to assemble these materials into a new mythology. They lived in a culture saturated with death imagery, with memory of empire, with new scientific anxieties, and with sustained interest in the unseen. The vampire figure that would occupy Bram Stoker arrived at the intersection of all these currents. It carried the village revenant and the urbane, predatory noble. It bore the scent of disease and the tingle of forbidden contact. It drew on orientalizing anxieties and on the metropolitan fascination with the exotic. It was ready to be reshaped into a modern monster. The literary night is therefore not an isolated genre. It is the symptom of a culture negotiating modernity, the moment when art, science, and rumor combined to render old fears in new clothes. That moment created appetite for figures who could both thrill and instruct. Dracula emerges from that atmosphere as a late product of long cultural work, a creature whose teeth are as much the result of social conditions as of individual invention. When the novel arrives, it does not invent the cultural night. It inhabits it, and it demonstrates how deeply the 19th century understood its own shadows. Bram Stoker emerges from a tangle of ordinary details that add up to an uncommon capacity for design. He was not a creature of sudden genius. He was an accumulator. He gathered materials the way a carpenter gathers boards, measuring each piece against the others until a structure becomes inevitable. Childhood illness narrowed his world, but widened his attention. The long hours of enforced stillness trained a patience that later came to his fiction as a predilection for slow accretion. Convalescence taught him to read the body like a text, to note symptom and rhythm, and to imagine decline as a narrative that could be described in clinical registers and folded into lyric description. The theater fixed him in a discipline of spectacle. For decades, he inhabited the world behind the stage, learning that drama is less about revelation than about the management of expectation. He managed actors, schedules, and reputations. He arranged lights and props so that a single gesture could carry an entire scene. The theatrical mind thinks in setups and payoffs, in cues and echoes, in the way a recurring motif can gather meaning across an evening. Stoker took that sensory training into literature. He learned to time silences, to withhold, to return to an image until it attained a pressure that demanded release. He learned how a crowd collectively leans forward and how to make them lean for an hour and then for another. Paperwork gave him form. Administrative life teaches a certain faith in record. Receipts, ledgers, itineraries, and contracts create a habit of thinking in lists and in cross-references. Stoker converted that habit into narrative architecture. The novel asks the reader to accept documents as evidence. A diary entry, a ship log, a newspaper clipping, a medical certificate, all these are props that create trust. That trust is the novelistic mechanism Stoker uses to nudge belief. He understood the rhetorical power of official-looking items. They lend credibility because modern readers intuitively trust records, even when those records are assembled to persuade. Stoker was an inveterate collector of voices and traces. He filled notebooks with half-remembered phrases, with paraphrases of sources, with travel descriptions clipped from newspapers, with legends noted in conversation. He read widely in the periodicals of his time, mining reviews, travel accounts, antiquarian studies, and folklore compendia. He borrowed freely from continental pamphleteering, especially from German accounts that had turned a violent prince into a morality play. He read ethnographies that recorded the practices of remote villages, and he scanned legal documents and police reports for the procedural language he would later imitate. The novel is a collage, but it is a collage assembled with an eye for tonal consistency. Stoker knew which shards fit and which would jar. The process of writing was incremental. He did not set out to produce a single monstrous scene and then work backwards. He assembled episodes, tested them against one another, and arranged them into a sequence that amplified uncertainty. Drafts grew by accretion, He added a diary here, a telegram there, and watched how each item altered the cumulative plausibility of the whole. He revised with the attention of someone accustomed to reconciling accounts, making sure that times and places aligned so that a ship log might plausibly meet a journal entry. That labor made the uncanny feel procedural and thus more unsettling. Professional friendship shaped his sensibility in subtle ways. Henry Irving taught him how to think in stage directions and tonal shifts. Actors and company members provided manners and gestures that later appeared as detail in scenes. Journalists and critics shaped his sense of audience. Colleagues offered anecdotes that became small narrative engines. Even the business of publicity showed him how reputation is manufactured by repetition and spectacle. A single image in the press can expand into a public narrative that shapes how events are remembered. Stoker knew this and exploited it by building moments in his book that resembled press images, snapshots designed to be retold. The cultural climate offered psychological stock to be used. Late Victorian anxieties about urbanization, the integrity of the social body, the permeability of boundaries, and the reach of empire provided thematic fuel. Stoker was not simply extracting horror. He was organizing the fears of his readers. He located menace in the most intimate sites of Victorian life, the private bedroom, the family household, the trusting circle of friends. By placing the threat inside the nucleus of domestic life, he turned public anxiety into personal dread. The novel operates by moving a danger from the periphery into the locus of trust. Stoker also had an uneasy relationship with modern science that he translated into fiction. He respected method and record, but he also suspected that method might be incomplete. The era's fascination with contagion, with unseen vectors, and with the emergent languages of pathology gave him metaphors as readily as it supplied documentary props. He used medical detail not to explain the uncanny fully, but to complicate its legibility. Scientific reports in the text function like ambivalent testimonies. They make the phenomena harder to dismiss by giving them an appearance of empirical discussion while leaving space for supernatural interpretation. The novel's structure deserves emphasis. The epistolary form serves multiple functions at once. It fragments authority, making every statement provisional and situational. It democratizes observation, allowing a chorus of witnesses to speak and thus to validate or contradict one another. It also produces a mosaic of intimacy, since diaries record private perceptions and telegrams record compressed urgency. The form replicates investigative procedure. The reader becomes a kind of inquest officer, gathering documents and interpreting gaps. That procedural engagement converts curiosity into belief. The slow accumulation of plausible detail is the rhetorical motor of the book. Geography is thematic engineering. Stoker staged a movement from margin to center that maps onto modern anxieties about contamination. The Carpathian margins are presented as a repository of archaic power, a place where older logics persist. The sea voyage is a liminal corridor where contamination moves between systems. London is the exemplum of modernity, densely networked and apparently resistant to ancient forces, yet vulnerable precisely because it is networked. Stoker designed these spaces to show how a local habit can become a systemic risk when routed through the infrastructural lines of modern life: ships, trains, telegraphs, and social circles. The narrative then becomes an anatomy of systemic infection. Stoker was attentive to gender and to the mechanics of desire in ways that complicate simple readings. The novel represents women both as objects of protection and as loci of taboo attraction. Female characters are raised as moral figures and then sometimes rendered as sites of uncanny threat. The tension between protection and eroticization allows Stoker to dramatize Victorian anxieties about female agency and about the destabilizing potential of the intimate. The sexualized imagery around the vampire bite functions as a metaphor for transgression and for the permeability of social boundaries. Publication context shaped the book as reception and afterlife. Serialized fiction and the market for sensation meant that authors could design for public appetite. Stoker provided texture that satisfied readers who desired both atmospheric dread and documentary plausibility. The novel's initial audience encountered it as both entertainment and as a thing that engaged culturally held fears. Critics could praise or condemn, and their reactions then fed back into public perception. The press amplified certain readings and minimized others, producing a conversation that extended the book's life beyond its pages. Stoker also contended with the legacy of earlier vampire tales. He read Polidori and Le Fanu, and he absorbed theatrical and literary precedents that informed his choices. He did not invent the vampire from scratch. He synthesized. Where earlier writers imagined seductive aristocrats or uncanny female predators, Stoker combined elements to produce a figure that could operate across registers. His Dracula is at once aristocratic and monstrous, a being who carries ancient rites and who navigates modern transport. That hybrid shape allowed the monster to speak to multiple anxieties: class, contagion, empire, and sexual transgression. Finally, Stoker's ethical imagination complicates the project. He did not offer easy villains or simple punishments. He staged moral uncertainty. His protagonists resort to methods that verge on extremity. The defenders of the social body sometimes enact violence that echoes the brutality they oppose. The novel, therefore, holds a mirror to the moral compromises of modernity. It asks how far a society can go in defending itself before becoming what it fears. That ethical tension gives the book intellectual ballast. It moves the work beyond mere sensationalism and into moral inquiry. Bram Stoker, then, is less a single-authored origin of Dracula than a careful integrator of cultural materials, a designer who understood how to assemble evidence to produce belief. He practiced theatrical timing, administrative rigor, ethnographic curiosity, and moral sensitivity. He worked in drafts, in documents, in fragments that together produce a machine of dread. The result is not only a gripping story, but also an artifact that reveals the mechanics of how myth can be engineered through method, patience, and craft. Dracula is therefore not merely a creature of night. Dracula is an architecture, and Bram Stoker is the architect who understood precisely how to build a fear that could travel across centuries. A novel that holds attention for hours teaches a listener to listen. The ledger at the beginning is not a detail, it is a training regimen. Harker's journal reads like a surveyor's record. He notes route and hour, the hollow sound of the carriage on a graded road, the rattling of harness rings. Those small items feel ordinary enough to be ignored, and that is their sly power. The book uses ordinariness to build credibility. The mind that learns to register the mundane is primed to accept the strange when it arrives. At the castle, the welcome is curated. The Count moves like a careful host who catalogs objects the way a scholar catalogs specimens. He traces a map with a finger, his gesture precise and slow. Harker sees plates with odd patterns, a servant who will not meet a gaze, curtains that unlatch themselves without wind. Each micro-oddity is a tiny, unresolved promise. They do not scream, they wait. The narrative accumulates unease by stringing small awkwardness together until the listener feels a fabric of wrongness beneath apparent courtesy. Night there is orchestrated. A candle gutters and the room inhales. Wolves call on the edge of hearing, and the howl becomes a punctuation mark. Harker wakes with fragments of speech on his tongue, with a half-memory that feels like prayer but lacks words. He records the fragment, and it gains weight simply by being recorded. The book uses repetition like a craftsman uses a chisel. A phrase returned to in different contexts becomes a landmark for memory. That recurrence is a retention mechanism. The listener remembers because the text taught them to. The Demeter chapter is a model of compact terror. A ship log is a narrowing of language as sanity thins. The sentences lose decoration, become shorter, more jagged. Crew members disappear in sequence like candles in a row put out by an invisible hand. A sealed crate arrives with a manifest that names soil as mundane cargo. The crate smells of earth rich and foreign. A single dog leaps ashore at the quay and dies under the lamplight. That single image holds because it is small, specific, and repeatable. It can be described in a single sentence and then recalled in many contexts. Stoker uses such shards to create memory anchors the listener will carry forward. Lucy's decline is staged in increments that map easily into micro-scenes. First, sleepwalking. She moves through a house like someone following a script for which the mind has lost authorship. A neighbor glimpses a pale figure at a window, and later a friend finds a thumb-sized ring of blood on a pillow. The mark repeats. Each repetition turns curiosity into pattern, and pattern into dread. The move from private oddity to doctor notes to public worry is narrative propulsion. The listener follows because each small image leads to the next small document. Van Helsing's arrival reorganizes tone into method. He reads cases like a diagnostician and reads folklore like a field manual. He prescribes both blood, transfusion, and the placement of garlic. He writes notes in Latin and then speaks to a household in the blunt language of ritual. That dual register is useful for the narrative because it offers two ways of believing. A skeptical listener can follow the clinical description. A listener moved by myth can follow the old rite. The tension between registers produces sustained interest because it asks which instrument will hold. Mina at the typewriter makes sound into order. Her fingers strike keys with a rhythm that can anchor long audio stretches. The click-click becomes a metronome and a memory cue. She transcribes journals, builds indexes, matches dates. Her patient indexing transforms narrative chaos into a dossier. That dossier is what permits sudden action later. The audience trusts quick movement when it is backed by visible preparation. Each typed page is a small earned payment on future drama. Dr. Seward's Asylum introduces grotesque specificity. Renfield eats flies and counts them. The image is immediate and repulsive and therefore cathartic. Renfield's lucid flashes offer hints about the Count, while his mania provides comic and horrific relief in quick alternation. The asylum nights are textured with slippers on linoleum, the sound of breathing, the rustle of paper. These are small beats that can be repeated and that will anchor memory during longer stretches of exposition. Documents act as little detonators. A telegram with a terse line alters a room. A shipping manifest shows a crate listed for a warehouse that denies knowledge. A diary entry crossed out and then rewritten suggests panic. Stoker uses paper as both delay and reveal. Present an artifact and then draw out its consequences across several scenes. Each artifact promises an answer and then complicates it. That sense of postponed resolution keeps the ear leaning forward. Feeding scenes are carefully choreographed intimacies. The Count leans, teeth find skin, breath comes shallow. The moment is sensory. The metallic taste reported by a victim, the slackening of a wrist, the pallor that deepens by degrees. Stoker avoids gratuitous gore and instead details the micro-sequence of touch and sensation. These tactile notes are easy to imagine and therefore perfect for audio. Repetition of the pattern across victims creates an expectation the listener waits to see confirmed. Domestic invasion hurts because it violates trust. A parlor with a lamp low, a woman reading by lamplight, the subtle pressure at a throat. A hairpin drops and is not retrieved. A chair is slightly moved. These small disturbances register emotionally because they happen in rooms the listener recognizes from life. The narrative prefers bedrooms and tables to distant battlefields because the betrayal feels intimate and the audience cares. Sensory anchors can be audio hooks, the metallic clink of a syringe, the smell of foreign earth when a trunk opens, the steady click of a typewriter, a dog baying in an alley, the hiss of wind through roof tiles. The script can foreground these sounds and then return to them later. Each return triggers recognition and cements memory. That technique turns repeated sensory detail into a reward for attentive listening. Professional debates are dramatic devices. Physicians gather, notebooks open, one reads vital statistics while another revives folk remedies. The argument stalls action, but it intensifies curiosity. Listeners remain because they want to know which theory will prevail and how the choice will affect action. The pause functions as pressure. When it finally releases into midnight stakes or a rush transfusion, the payoff is gratifying because the build was visible. The early logistics scenes demonstrate how modern systems serve both menace and remedy. Shipping manifests, customs desks, port clerks, train timetables, telegraph offices all become nodes to watch. Stoker teaches the reader to watch clerks and to read manifests. That attention to mundane bureaucracy makes the invasion believable. The listener learns to count the time a telegram takes and to see a missed train as a crisis. Turning administration into drama is a retention trick because it makes the story calculable and the stakes measurable. Renfield acts as a local barometer. His obsessions prefigure larger dynamics. When he eats insects, he imagines gaining life. His muttered agreements with an unseen presence foreshadow the Countess' influence. His few lucid utterances read like clues. The book often rewards memory when a small phrase from Renfield reappears with new significance. Those payoffs create a feeling of cleverness in the listener, and that feeling keeps them invested. Short recurring images are the narrative spine. The dog on the quay, the typewriter click, the smell of soil, the ring of blood. Each image recurs at deliberate beats and rewards recall. A listener who remembers earlier images feels plugged into the story. That feeling is a small social reward, and it encourages continued listening. Scenes of personal care anchor heroism in tenderness. A hand smoothing a brow, a careful transfusion, a bandage applied in the dark. These micro acts of care are small triumphs within terror. They humanize the protagonist and deepen listener attachment. In long-form narrative attachment to characters is often what sustains interest more than the abstract threat. The book strings these small engines together, so the narrative moves the series of near-term payoffs. A clue presented and then resolved within a few minutes yields satisfaction. A motif returned acts as a callback reward. The alternation of investigation and movement prevents fatigue. The listener experiences a rhythm of curiosity, then resolution, then renewed curiosity. As the early acts close, the novel tightens. The ledger quickens. The typewriter rhythm is interrupted by a sharp telegram. The team shifts from careful cataloging to urgent planning. The last document before movement is a manifest misfiled at a port. A single line reads like a fuse burning toward action. The book pauses with that line, and in that pause, the tempo tilts. The next movement will be counted in steam whistles and telegraph dashes. The chase will begin. The telegram arrives like a summons, a cold rectangle of paper that reorders a dozen small certainties, a single line of type, a time, a birth, and the ledger now reads as instruction. The team moves from slow cataloging to choreography. Typewriter clicks fade. Lantern light is snuffed and replaced by the high whine of a steam whistle. The tempo changes, and the narrative body responds as if pulled by a visible string. Trains are veins, and the novel treats them as such. A timetable misread costs a morning. A missed connection costs a ferry crossing and perhaps a life. The ear learns to listen for station announcements, for the metallic stutter of brakes, for the distant rumble of a bridge that will hold 2 carts and 3 secrets. A man who misses a train because his bootlace comes undone loses more than time. That undone lace becomes a nervous image to return to later. A small human failing that pays forward as suffering and then as motive. Details like laces become retention hooks because they are bodily and immediate. The group splits into cells to cover ground. One rider takes a bleak road where fog eats hedgerows. Another moves with lanterns between inns, checking beds and trunks. A clerk returns to the port office and hunts the misfiled manifest with the desperate focus of a diver searching for air. Each split provides variety. Each small team faces its own micro-crisis. A ferryman refuses to cross without coin, or a customs clerk demands a signature that took days to secure. Those small obstacles are dramatic because they are recognizable friction, the human seams in an otherwise tight machine. Night rides compress time into sensory beats. Leather creaks. The horse's breath hangs in white silk. The rider hears twig snaps and expects an ambush, and each twig becomes its own miniature cliffhanger. The ground can betray. Wheels sink in a marsh, and the carriage groans as if a beast had seized its belly. A rider dismounts, and the mud clings to boots like memory. Hands are cold, fingers numb, but the lanterns must be kept steady because a dropped light is a lost lead. That tactile attention sustains listening because it invites the imagination to inhabit skin and cold and smell. Marshland ambushes make the earth a character. Mire pulls at wheels. Silt hides traps. A horse flails, a rider is pitched. The sound of mud tearing at leather is audible in the mind. A hat floats past like a lost head. The group must extract the trapped carriage, reforge the plan, and lose time. Each minute lost is quantifiable. The narrative turns these minutes into tension currency. When the chase resumes, the listener feels the cost because the narration has shown the sticky ground and the exhausted hands that fought it. Telegrams are volatile objects. A misaddressed line reroutes the search. A scratched ink changes a port name. The small clerk who misreads a number becomes the pivot of a whole morning. Stoker uses these tiny administrative faults to create believable failure modes. The system is only as good as its human parts. When the protagonists improvise, the improvisation is heroic because it repairs human error. The listener celebrates small repairs because they are concrete and fast. Confrontations at inns are set pieces of compression. A candle tilts and a glass rings. A drawer opens, and a trunk breathes out the smell of foreign earth. The scent returns in the mind like a bell. A customs note shoved into a pocket becomes the object that resolves a subplot. The narrative arranges these discoveries like beads on a string. Each bead is small. Each bead snaps into place with audible satisfaction for the listener. Mina remains the archive and the moral center. Even in motion, her method persists. She sorts telegrams on a lap, fingers inked, face lit by a pocket lamp. Her calm indexation turns fragments into a map. A phrase she remembers from a letter unlocks a memory in a market keeper and produces the detail needed to locate a warehouse. Mina's small acts of care anchor the group and the listener. When she folds a handkerchief, and there is a smear of foreign dust at the corner, the listener knows that the smell that haunted the Demeter is returning. The recognition is a small triumph. Van Helsing operates at the intersection of ritual and technique. He arranges a steak like a surgeon prepares a scalpel. He instructs watchers on how to place garlic, how to stay awake, how to bind a sleeping body without waking terror. His language alternates Latin and blunt command. He treats folk remedy as field-tested practice and modern medicine as complement. That duality makes his scenes satisfying because they provide both the tactile work and the intellectual scaffolding. A ritual performed correctly produces a temporary zone of safety, and the listener feels the relief. Renfield's murmurings take on new significance. His insistence that life is consumed and held becomes a whisper that echoes across the chase. When a witness reports a man who spoke to a box and then to the earth, the phrase fits like a key in a lock. Renfield's odd baubles, his jars of insects, his small rituals are now little indicators of the Countess' reach. The novel repays attention by returning these small notes in new contexts. As the hunt moves across country, the narrative structure favors short scenes with clean payoffs. An intercepted telegram leads to a furious half hour. A market conversation produces a lead about a crate. A late-night watch reveals a chateau leaving a warehouse. Each micro-victory is sufficient to regulate attention. The listener receives a string of satisfactions, so that long duration does not feel like endurance, but like a sequence of small triumphs. The use of sound is strategic. The typewriter click returns as an auditory breadcrumb when Mina finishes a transcription that points to a crossing time. The hiss of a train is used twice, once when the chase accelerates, and later when a trap is sprung that uses a delayed train to isolate a suspect. The smell of the earth is invoked each time a crate is opened, so that olfactory memory cues become mnemonic anchors. Repeating sound and smell builds a scaffold for long memory. The final approach to the Countess soil is described as precise reconnaissance. The group times patrols, notes moon phases, calculates guard rotations. Lead riders test roads while clerks check manifests for later confirmation. The plan is drawn in pencil on a map with smudged lines. A single miscount can ruin everything. The narrative keeps tension by maintaining checklists and then removing one item at the last moment to force improvisation. That subtraction produces a spike in focus. The listener feels the brittle balance. The closing operation is organized like an engine. Roles are clear because earlier scenes embedded those roles into the listener's memory. One man poses as laborer and handles boxes of earth with a deliberate clumsiness. Another faints at the gate to draw patrol away. Someone hammers while others listen for breath. The sound of hardwood meeting soft soil is a micro beat that the ear holds. The group moves like a machine, assembled from parts that have been rehearsed across the narrative. That mechanical precision makes the climax readable and satisfying. Violent details remain terse. Stoker avoids spectacle for spectacle's sake and instead focuses on instrumentality. A stake passes through cloth and into chest. The sound of wood driven home is heard. A last rattle of breath, a cusp of light behind lashes, the scent of released dust. Those small auditory facts deliver emotional closure without indulgence. They are deliverable in voice with restraint and land heavily. The aftermath returns to domestic texture. Beds are made. Letters are written. Curtains are drawn and the typewriter returns to its solitary rhythm. The click-click heals rhythmically. A small dog returns to a familiar corner and sleeps. Yet the narrative leaves residue. A character dreams of a shape at a window. A once trusted route now tastes of danger. An old map keeps a pin, and the pin hurts the finger when brushed. Those residuals act like an afterimage and prevent facile resolution. The listener closes a long session with relief, and with a quiet echo of a story that keeps a small seam open. Symbolic resonance grows from these concrete moves. The novel demonstrates that modern infrastructure is ambivalent. Rails and telegraphs speed both invasion and rescue. Offices that track manifests also create the records that unmake the threat. That ambivalence is the novel's lesson about modernity. Objects like the manifest, the telegraph slip, the typewritten page become emblems. They are the things that anchor modern faith. They are also the things that show fragility. Sexual undertones remain lodged in domestic details. The bite is described as intimate touch, not theatrical spectacle. A kiss at midnight is a violation because it is a perversion of care. Sleepwalking scenes convert erotic suggestion into danger. Those small intimacies remain more resonant than long lectures about desire. They are tactile and immediate. Disease emerges through clinical registers, thermometer readings, pulse checks, transfusion bags, the steady work of physicians linking signs into patterns. That language gives the vampire an epidemiological shape. The novel anticipates the language of public health and uses it to make metaphor literal. The reader hears the diagnostic terms as tools and as warnings. Ultimately, the novel is engineered for attention. Short beats and sensory anchors, alternating tempo, recurring motifs, serialized micro cliffhangers. All of these produce a listening map that can sustain 2 hours. The story teaches the audience how to hold moment to moment by giving frequent, credible resolution. The small wins accumulate and carry the listener through the larger arc. When the hunt ends and the prosthetic repair of community begins, the mind that has listened has been trained to notice small signs. The narrative leaves the listener equipped with motifs to carry forward. The typewriter click, the telegraph dash, the smell of foreign earth, the dog on a key, the small ring of blood on a pillow. These are not just details. They are the memory scaffolding that will anchor the symbolic reading to come. The chase ends, and the novel breathes out. The record remains. Paper closes. The lamp is moved, and the night continues. The stage is set now to ask what the chase meant. The next movement is to step back and see the creature in light of the symbols it has been made to carry. Meaning in long stories often arrives by accretion of image. A single phrase repeated, a ritual gesture performed again and again, a concrete smell or sound that returns at key moments. These little things gather weight until they become persuasive. Dracula works like that. The novel offers a handful of images and practices that recur until they do the heavy lifting of interpretation. The symbolic core is not a single theory. It is a constellation of motifs that hang together because they are constantly grounded in the physical acts of the plot. Disease and contamination, sexual transgression and repression, foreign threat and cultural anxiety, immortality and decay, modernity and the ancient world. Each of these themes is vivid because Stoker ties them to small, repeatable actions. Begin with disease. Disease in Dracula is not a metaphor made abstract. It is palpably procedural. The physician records a temperature at midnight, reads a pulse, notes pallor, orders a transfusion. The transfusion scene is concrete. A glass bottle hanging, the metallic clink of needles, warm blood sliding into a vein, a patient sinking and then returning. Those details give the idea of contagion a body. A listener can hear the siphon of a bag and can imagine the slow emptying. Through those images, disease becomes a grammar for danger that is natural and scientific. The text, therefore, allows a clinical reading of the vampire and makes the monster legible as epidemiology. When Lucy S. pallor deepens, when children are found sick near her, the reader can map the vampire onto the mechanisms of infection and treat the narrative as an early study in public health failure and intervention. That concreteness also makes the fear of contamination feel immediate. The Demeter brings boxes of soil. The boxes are unlabeled. Customs men glance and sign. The crate opens and the smell of foreign earth spreads. Smell is a powerful mnemonic. It is primitive and therefore immediate. Stoker uses odor like a signal. The smell of the Countess soil becomes the token of contamination. It is not called elaborate theory. It is a tactile fact. The presence of that odor at a coffin, at a bedside, at a trunk in a dock creates recognition and dread. Dracula, as a narrative, therefore teaches listeners the simple rule that strangers can carry things into a community that alter its body. In an age before germ theory had settled comfortably into public habit, smell and visible waste were the trusted signs. Stoker's descriptions exploit that trust. Sexuality appears in the novel with equal concreteness. Sex in Dracula often appears as touch, as a kiss, as a slow pressure on the throat. The famous bride scenes are sensorial. A woman half lifted by another woman in a dark chamber. A mouth pressed into a neck, hair spread like a curtain, breath close and hot. Those images are vivid in the ear because they operate at the level of sensation. Sexual anxiety in the Victorian moment did not exist as philosophy alone. It acted in beds, in curtains, in the late hour. Stoker writes the kiss so precisely that it can be shown as a small action and then read as a symbol. The bite is erotic and invasive at once. The sexual reading is therefore not an allegory remote from the story. It is a direct mapping from physical act to cultural fear. The novel therefore works on the listener by making desire both attractive and dangerous, in ways embodied in bedsheets, in whispers, in sleepwalking. Repression is the social mechanism that gives those scenes their charge. The quiet room that forbids frank talk about the body becomes the perfect stage for stealth. A society that insists on modesty creates private pressure. When pressure needs escape, it finds subterranean roots. The vampire-esque intimacy becomes the narrative symptom of repressed desire. Mina-esque methodical handwriting, Lucy-esque faint smiles, the private notes folded into envelopes. These are cultural containers. Small acts of concealment and revelation cultivate tension. The symbolic core shows repression as a pressure that makes the dangerous intimacy taste sweeter and therefore more threatening. Foreign threat is a concrete motif. The Count arrives from an explicit periphery. He moves by ship, by manifest, by port clerk signatures. The travel itself is paperwork. The cloak of exoticism is a stack of crates. That the foreign is dangerous is not a vague cultural prejudice in the text. It is literally rendered in the novel's logistics. The foreign earth is moved by legitimate commerce. The problem is not only that the stranger is unknown. The problem is that modern systems trust documentation and can be deceived. The novel, therefore, dramatizes a worry at the center of imperial modernity, that the very channels built to manage global exchange can be exploited by threats that look banal on paper. The manifest, therefore, becomes an emblem of both modern order and its vulnerability. Immortality and decay are twin images that play across one another. The Count is ancient but animated. He brings relics into modern rooms, and he sits like a preserved thing among living furniture. In the castle, the air smells of old wax and rope, of leather and old maps. Those textures say endurance. But the human bodies he touches age into pallor. Immortality in the book has a moral cost. The Countess' unending nights are accompanied by slow decompositions. The novel uses the contrast to ask what is sacrificed by a refusal to die. The living decay into a state between life and absence. In audio, this contrast can be shown in paired images. The cool wind blowing across a cold flagstone, and the warm hand slipping into a pillowcase that will not return the warmth. The symbolic core shows immortality as both envy and indictment. Modernity versus the ancient world is a structural dialectic in the novel. The Carpathian mountain scenes are full of peasant rites and deep soil. The city scenes are full of trains, telegraphs, hospitals, offices. Narrative moves menace from the margins into the hub. That movement is the novel's central architecture. Modern machinery, which promises progress, is shown to be porous. Telegraph messages that coordinate a hunt are the same technology that moved the threat into the heart. The museumized castle is the repository of an ancient logic that modernity can neither wholly absorb nor entirely contain. Stoker's text refuses simple nostalgia or blind triumphalism. It stages the encounter and insists on complexity. The lesson is not that modernity is wrong. It is that modernity is incomplete. The symbolic argument becomes practical. If tradition contains knowledge, modernity must learn how to translate it into action. Van Helsing's role in the group models that translation in both ritual and procedure. The predator of the night stands as a psychological shadow. The vampire is a name for the anxiety that people feel about their own appetites. The novel provides small scenes that make that shadow tangible. A man bitten becomes shy or secretive. Sleep becomes a trap. A house that once felt safe becomes a theater of suspicion. The symbol works because it moves from inner to outer. It externalizes private appetite as a visible danger. That externalization lets communities act. The hunt is as much a search for social peace as it is a quest for a monster. The symbolic core, therefore, makes the vampire useful. It is a social object around which policing and caregiving can be organized. Symbolic readings flourish precisely because the novel is generous with sensory detail. A repeated tactile image like the ring of blood on a pillow translates across themes. It is at once a disease marker, an erotic residue, a sign of intrusion, a material token that links acts that seem disparate when read abstractly. The ring becomes meaningful because it is repeated in different contexts, and because each repetition ties it to a slightly different register. The novel, therefore, uses material repetition to create an interpretive rope that a listener can pull on. To explain how these symbols connect with real-world anxieties, place them in moments that listeners know. In the late 19th century, European cities were sites of immigration, of international trade, of new microbes, and of new sciences. A family in a townhouse worried about nightly visitors, about meals, about drafts in winter, and about neighbors entering the market. The narrative leverages those quotidian cares and turns them into mythic geometry. The fear of contamination, therefore, maps onto the fear of strangers, and on the anxiety that industrial transport erases local control. Sexual repression maps onto changing gender roles in a world where women sometimes stepped into public life. The vampire is a container for all those mixed anxieties. Stoker also ties the symbolic core to moral contingency. The group that hunts the count uses extreme measures. They drive stakes. They break graves. They burn boxes. Those acts reassert community power. But those acts also mirror the violence that had earlier been used to establish political order in other times and places. The novel allows the hunt to be morally complicated. The group acts out of care, but their instruments are themselves violent. The symbolic core, therefore, refuses pure vindication. It insists that defense sometimes replicates the methods of offense, and that moral clarity is a complex outcome of compromise. Concrete rituals make symbolic meanings teachable. Placing garlic at a window is not purely superstition. In the narrative, it is a practice that buys time and organizes watchfulness. Marking graves is not purely symbolic. It is a public act that communicates memory and boundary. The inclusion of ritual elements in the novel creates a curriculum of response. The reader can learn not only what to fear, but what to do. That practicality makes the symbolism actionated rather than speculative. In a culture anxious about contagion and foreign trade, practical rituals are psychologically urgent. Stoker recognized that and wove ritual into the procedural heart of the text. The symbolic core also uses character contrasts as living allegories. Van Helsing is the trad modern hybrid. He references old peasant practices and then orders clinical measures. Jonathan is a youthful believer who learns caution. Mina is the archivist who turns private memory into public instrument. Lucy is the tragic figure who embodies the consequence of violation. Each person adds a viewpoint to the symbolic lattice. The characters are not mere mouthpieces. They are concrete people whose small choices teach the listener the complex meanings the text proposes. Finally, the symbolic core is built with a dramaturgical discipline that serves retention. Small, repeated images, sensory anchors, alternating registers of science and superstition, and short procedural payoffs make the thematic argument accessible. The listener does not need to be instructed to believe an interpretation. The narrative makes the interpretation feel inevitable by tying it to things the ear can remember. The typewriter click, the smell of earth, the metallic clink of transfusion, the ring of blood on a pillow. To hold the symbolic core in this way is to allow a long episode to be both satisfying and reflective. The story becomes a machine for meaning because its imagery is constant, concrete, and repeatable. When symbols are made pragmatic in this way, they stop being puzzles and start being tools. Disease imagery trains a public imagination to see contagion and to act. Sexual imagery forces a discussion of intimacy and power in the private sphere. The foreignness motif warns about infrastructure vulnerabilities. Immortality versus decay asks what price is paid for escaping time. The predator as shadow gives a social name to private appetite. Each symbol, therefore, transforms private fear into an item the community can hold, discuss, and respond to. That conversion is the novel-esque lasting trick. It turns scattered anxieties into a small set of images that can be rehearsed, that can be argued about, that can be dramatized on stage and in print, and that can travel into the century after the book was written. The power of the symbolic core lies in its portability. A ring of blood, a whiff of foreign earth, a typewritten ledger, a late telegram, a midnight kiss. These are simple things that carry layered meaning. They travel easily from candlelit parlor to railway carriage to modern cinema. They are parables made of physical gestures rather than abstract theses. That is why Dracula keeps returning as a cultural object. The symbolic core is compact, movable, and stubbornly comprehensible even as contexts shift. Stories travel because they find new bodies to inhabit. Dracula left the page quickly because stage and film discovered in him a machine for spectacle and sensation. The first theatrical adaptations treated the novel as a script for movement and presence. A stage can show the uncanny as gesture and timing. Actors learned to hold a look in a way that made audiences feel observed. Theatrical Dracula relied on set pieces its makers could stage night after night. A door slammed in the dark, a hand appearing where no one expected, a cape spreading like shadow. The stage taught future retellings how to choreograph absence. Early stage productions also simplified plot. A long epistolary novel becomes a single evening of scenes. Cuts are surgical. Side characters are combined. The hunt becomes condensed. That compression made Dracula portable. Audiences who had never read the book could experience the core beats. Arrival from abroad, strange deaths, a hunt, a final confrontation. Theater turned the novel into a ritual that could be repeated, and repetition is how a story roots in popular memory. Film then took the ritual and made it visual in a different register. Silent film, in particular, found in Dracula the ability to translate dread into movement without words. The 1920s German cinema picked up the tale and remade it into expressionist planes of light and shadow. Film made the castle a series of angles, the Count a silhouette, the voyage a montage of empty chairs and tossed paperwork. Directors discovered that editing could increase menace by shortening attention windows and by repeating small images quickly. The cinematic cut amplified the novel-esque mini cliffhangers into visual staccato. Nosferatu is a key chapter. It reimagined the monster with a skeletal silhouette and an animal-hunched gait. The film stripped aristocratic gloss and returned to primal menace. Because it altered names and details, it ran into legal problems with the book's estate. That legal fight itself demonstrates how intellectual property can shape myth. The courts demanded changes, and that complaint became part of the story about adaptation and ownership. Even failed attempts to suppress a version can amplify it. Nosferatu circulated in prints and screenings and then influenced other filmmakers who borrowed its framing. The long fingers, the rat-like nods, the idea that a monster could be more insect than noble. Hollywood then remade Dracula into a figure of glamour and menace at once. Early sound films gave the Count a voice, and voice became a new instrument. The cadence of an Eastern accent, the hush of a confession spoken low, the slow arrival of words in a drawing room. These became hooks. Actors like the early screen Draculas offered a particular look and a cadence that imprinted on popular imagination. Costuming also mattered. A high collar, a tailored coat, a moving cape. These visual tokens became shorthand for vampire presence across genres. The monster became wearable. Cinema also invented new metaphors. Film could show montage sequences of cities at night, of crowded streets, of sleeping windows. It could place a close-up on a pale cheek and then cut to an empty cradle. These visual juxtapositions made the symbolic reading of the novel easier for mass audiences. A film cut could suggest contamination by placing two unrelated images next to each other. That editing trick taught audiences to read the vampire as a vector. Directors learned to rely on image chaining to produce meaning quickly. Stage and screen also internationalized Dracula. Plays toured and films screened in different countries. Each new performance altered tone to match local anxieties. In some places, the Count became a foreign colonizer. In others, he became a decadent aristocrat. The adaptability of the figure meant that the myth could be remixed to fit local fears. The core images travel easily. A coffin, a bite, a stake. Those portable objects allow the story to be retold in many tongues while preserving emotional force. Beyond high art, Dracula moved into commodity culture. Posters, lithographs, illustrated press pieces, and later stills and trailers created a visual lexicon. A single image of a cape or a glowing eye could advertise an entire narrative. That visual shorthand made the story easy to reference and to parody. Merchandising both democratized and trivialized the figure. A postcard image can make a horror into a souvenir, and that democratization helps myths survive by making them ubiquitous. Adaptation also meant reinterpretation. Nosferatu turned Count into animal. Hollywood made him seductive. Mid-century adaptations recast the vampire into social commentary or into comedic riff. Each reinterpretation taught audiences what could be kept and what could be changed. The persistence of certain motifs across versions is revealing. If a detail is dropped, it is often because it is not useful for spectacle. If a detail is kept, it becomes a durable element of the myth. Costume, throat bite, nocturnal arrival, foreign soil. The hunt these endure because they are cheap to stage and rich in effect. Legal battles around adaptation matters because they teach how culture polices invention. The court fight over Nosferatu and the later estate negotiations with studios shaped who could claim what. But legal fights also circulated the name further. Press attention around trials exposed new groups to the story and made adaptation part of the cultural conversation. Litigation is therefore oddly productive for myth-making. It forces people to talk and to see reproduced images. That noise becomes part of the afterlife. Radio serialized versions extended the myth into the realm of voice alone. Without images, creators used sound to conjure the same small hooks, creaking floors, the click of a typewriter, a whispered name. Radio extended the story into domestic spaces where listeners imagined details themselves. That personalization of imagery deepened emotional investment because the mind supplies the scary parts. Radio adaptations taught the myth how to live inside private imagination rather than only on stage. Television and later streaming made Dracula recurring and episodic. Series could explore character and motive. They could slow reveal and allow for long arcs about desire, power, and belonging. Television taught a later generation to invest in serialized returns. The vampire became a franchise, not merely an icon. That serialization helped the myth survive by creating repeat viewership and by allowing reinterpretation across decades. Global film industries adapted the vampire into local forms. From Hammer horror ooze late 50s revivals to contemporary foreign language takes, the figure shifted with culture. A stylistic palette would be borrowed. Expressionist shadows here, Baroque staging there, minimal modern design elsewhere. The shape of the monster was malleable, but the emotional claim was constant. Fear of outsiders, fear of disease, fear of forbidden desire, these concerns travel. Dracula never dies in culture because the figure is modular and because the core motifs answer basic human anxieties. The story gives audiences a small set of tools to talk about contamination, intimacy, and cultural boundaries. It gives visible signs that a threat exists and that the community can act. In times of epidemic, a vampire story can be read as literal warning. In times of sexual panic, it can be read as moral fable. Its modular parts can be assembled into many arguments. The afterlife also thrives on reinterpretation by artists. Directors, playwrights, composers, and designers each bring a new lens. A set designer might focus on texture and produce a tactile menace that is different from a director's focus on performance. A composer can turn the count into melody. That diversity of craft keeps the figure fresh. Each new production becomes a dialogue with past versions. Audiences return to see what has changed and what remains. Finally, popular culture absorbs Dracula because it is easy to reference. A hat tipped in a cheap sketch can signal the idea immediately. That shorthand is currency. Once an image enters the cultural lexicon, it becomes usable in satire, in homage, in critique. The more it is used, the more it stays alive. The myth, therefore, feeds on reuse. The Afterlife of Dracula shows how a fiction becomes infrastructure. Stage, film, radio, television, print, and merchandise are channels. Each channel shapes the story in its own way. Each adaptation teaches new audiences how to feel the myth. The film Nosferatu, the first major adaptations in silent cinema and the early Hollywood Draculas, are not historical curiosities alone. They are the scaffolding on which modern fear has been rehearsed for a century. The story returns because it works as a machine for feeling. It is efficient and flexible, and therefore impossible to retire. There is a certain quiet that settles over the story once all its parts have been explored. History has spoken, folklore has risen, literature has taken shape, and culture has expanded the figure far beyond the place where it began. When the noise fades, what remains is the simple fact that a myth only survives when it reflects something stable inside the human mind. Dracula endured because each layer of the story touches a familiar fear: the fear of decay, the fear of losing control, the fear that the past is not finished with the present. These elements still move through modern life, and because they move, the myth continues to feel alive. A figure walking out of the dark does not need to be explained through theory. It lives in the places where uncertainty gathers. The deeper the journey goes into history, the clearer the continuity becomes. The villages that once feared wandering spirits, the courts that whispered about cruel princes, the Victorian streets that held their breath during nights of illness and superstition. Each era had its own shadow, and the myth formed by collecting them one by one. That is why the story never feels trapped in a single century. It carries the mood of many ages at once. A tale built from so many layers does not end neatly. It drifts into the present the same way it drifted through the past. Modern audiences do not see a monster from folklore or a villain from a novel. They see a symbol shaped by time, sharpened by imagination, and carried forward through countless retellings. The image changes, but the outline remains steady and recognizable. When the episode reaches its final moments, the atmosphere returns to the beginning. The castle on the cliff, the mountains older than any legend, the dark soil that once held the first stories. These images feel distant, yet they remain connected to everything that followed. The journey moves from ancient belief to historical violence to literary creation, then onward into film and modern culture, but the path always circles back to that first landscape. The story does not close because myths resist closure. They do not vanish when the last page turns or the final scene fades. They continue in the quiet spaces of memory. Once a viewer has walked through the long line of events that shape the figure, the presence of the myth settles in a new way. Not as fear, but as recognition. A recognition that every culture holds a shadow to help it understand its own mind. As the night settles again over the old world, the figure remains, watching from a distant window, moving through silent halls, waiting in the corners of imagination where stories gather strength. The journey ends here, but the myth does not. It continues forward the same way it has for centuries, carried by those who retell it, reshaped but never lost, steady as the night itself.